At 2 a.m. on February 8th, 1587, a woman who had been a queen since she was 6 days old sat down to write her final letter. In 6 hours, she would be dead. But what she chose to write about in those last moments wasn't revenge, wasn't a plea for mercy, wasn't even about herself. It was about the unpaid wages of her servants. Mary Stuart had spent 19 years as a prisoner in England, 19 years watching her health deteriorate, her hair turn grey, her body fail her, and in those final hours when most people would be consumed by terror or rage, she was making sure the people who had served her would be taken care of after she was gone. That letter, addressed to King Henri III of France, tells us more about who Mary really was than almost anything else in the historical record. Because this wasn't a woman defined by the plots and scandals that surrounded her. This was a woman who, facing death, thought first of others. But here's what makes her story even more tragic. The trial that condemned her was almost certainly rigged from the start. The man who orchestrated her downfall, Elizabeth's spy master Francis Walsingham, had spent years building a surveillance network specifically designed to catch Mary in a conspiracy. And when he finally did, historians have debated for centuries whether he simply caught her or whether he manufactured the very crime he accused her of. What follows is the story of the most dangerous woman in England, a queen without a throne, a threat without an army, a prisoner who terrified one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe simply by existing. To understand why Mary Stuart ended up on that scaffold, you have to understand one crucial fact. She was born into a claim to the English throne. Mary came into the world on December 8, 1542, at Linlithgow Palace in Scotland. Her father, King James V, died just 6 days later, making her Queen of Scotland before she could even lift her own head. But Mary wasn't just Queen of Scotland, she was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII of England, which meant she had a legitimate claim to Elizabeth's crown. And in the eyes of many Catholics across Europe, Mary's claim was actually better than Elizabeth's. Why? Because Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry VIII married after divorcing his first wife Catherine of Aragon. Catholics didn't recognise that divorce, which meant they didn't recognise Elizabeth as legitimate, which meant to them Mary Stuart was the rightful Queen of England. This wasn't just theological nitpicking, this was existential politics. Now put yourself in Elizabeth's position for a moment. You've fought your entire life to secure your throne. Your own sister Mary I nearly had you executed. You've survived plots, assassination attempts, religious upheaval. And now, living just across the Scottish border, is a woman that half of Europe believes should be sitting where you're sitting. What do you do with her? Mary's early life seemed destined for greatness. She was sent to France at age 5, raised at one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, and married the heir to the French throne when she was just 15. For a brief, shining moment, she was Queen of France and Queen of Scotland simultaneously. Then her young husband, Francis II, died in 1560. An 18-year-old Mary found herself a widow, sailing back to Scotland to rule a kingdom she barely remembered. What happened next was a catastrophe of her own making. In 1565, Mary married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a grandson of Margaret Tudor who strengthened her claim to the English throne. On paper, it was a strategic masterstroke. In reality, Darnley was weak, dissolute, and viciously ambitious. The marriage became a disaster almost immediately. And then, on the night of February 10th, 1567, Darnley's residence at Kirkhoe Field in Edinburgh exploded. Here's where it gets strange. When they found Darnley's body in a nearby orchard, he hadn't been killed by the blast. He'd been strangled. Someone had murdered him and then blown up the house, either to cover their tracks or to make absolutely certain he was dead. Suspicion immediately fell on the Earl of Bothwell, a charismatic Scottish nobleman who was rumoured to be Mary's lover. And what Mary did next destroyed any chance she had of maintaining her throne. 3 months after her husband's murder, just 3 months, Mary married Bothwell. The Scottish nobility, many of whom had previously supported her, saw this as confirmation of her guilt. They rose in rebellion. At Carberry Hill on June 15, 1567, Mary faced her own lords across a battlefield. According to eyewitness accounts, the two armies faced off in broiling heat, with messengers passing between them all day. Mary's troops grew desperately thirsty and exhausted. Bothwell tried to settle things through single combat but dismissed his opponents as beneath his station. Eventually Bothwell simply fled. left Mary alone on that hill to surrender to the Confederate lords. She was taken to Edinburgh, then imprisoned at Lochleven Castle. There, still suffering from physical and emotional trauma, having just experienced a miscarriage of twins fathered by Bothwell, she was forced to sign documents of abdication. Her infant son James, just 1 year old, became King of Scotland. Mary was 24 years old and her reign was over. After nearly a year of captivity, Mary managed to escape Lochleven in May 1568. But her forces were crushed at the Battle of Langside, and she faced an impossible choice: stay in Scotland and almost certainly be killed, or flee south to England and appeal to her cousin Elizabeth for help. Mary chose England. On May 16, 1568, she crossed the Solway Firth in a fishing boat, landing on English soil with hopes that Elizabeth, as a fellow queen and her cousin, would help her regain her throne. It was the worst decision of her life. Elizabeth faced an impossible dilemma. She couldn't legally justify holding an anointed queen without trial, but she couldn't release someone who was a living, breathing alternative to her own rule, a rallying point for every Catholic in Europe who wanted to see Elizabeth dead and the old religion restored. So Elizabeth did something unprecedented. She placed Mary under house arrest. Not for months, not for years, for 19 years. Mary was shuttled between various locations, each more remote than the last: Carlisle Castle in 1568, Bolton Castle in Yorkshire, Tutbury Castle in Staffordshire, a grim fortress that had been used as a royal stud farm, one of the grimmiest and most isolated of her prisons. Various other properties owned by the Earl of Shrewsbury, who became her jailer for 15 years. Despite his role as jailer, Shrewsbury was relatively kind to Mary. He treated her with the respect due to a queen. She was permitted a household of approximately 40 to 50 people: Scottish nobility, her physician, secretaries, maids, and cooks. She was allowed to take meals with multiple dishes from which to choose. But none of this changed the fundamental reality. Mary was a prisoner, and as the years dragged on, her health deteriorated. She developed rheumatism, arthritis, various ailments that modern medical historians attribute to her difficult captivity, yet she maintained her dignity, and she never abandoned her Catholic faith. Throughout the 1570s and early 1580s, Catholic plots against Elizabeth seemed to multiply. The Throckmorton plot of 1583, various schemes connected to the Spanish Inquisition. Every conspiracy that surfaced appeared to involve Mary as the intended beneficiary, the Queen who would replace Elizabeth and restore Catholicism to England. Elizabeth's council and parliament increasingly pressured her to execute Mary. But Elizabeth resisted. She understood something her advisors seemed to ignore. Executing an anointed queen would establish a terrifying precedent. If queens could be tried and killed by their subjects, that principle could someday be applied to Elizabeth herself. So the stalemate continued. Mary remained a prisoner. Elizabeth remained vulnerable. And across Europe, Catholic powers watched and waited. Enter Sir Francis Walsingham. Elizabeth's spy master had built an extensive surveillance network that monitored Mary's correspondence. By the 1580s, Walsingham was determined to gather evidence that would justify Mary's execution once and for all. In late 1585, Mary was transferred to Chartley Hall in Staffordshire under a new custodian, Sir Amyas Paulet, a strict Protestant utterly devoted to Elizabeth's service. Unlike Shrewsbury, Paulet showed Mary no kindness. He viewed her as a threat to be contained, nothing more. It was at Chartley that Walsingham set his trap. Working for him was a double agent named Gilbert Gifford, a man with impeccable Catholic credentials who had infiltrated Mary's household. Gifford convinced Mary that he had discovered a secure way for her to communicate with the outside world, by concealing letters in the cork of beer barrels that were regularly brought in and out of the castle. Mary was initially cautious. 19 years of captivity had taught her to trust no one, but eventually the temptation proved too great. She had been cut off from the world for so long. Here, finally, was a chance to communicate with her supporters. What she didn't know was that every single letter she sent or received passed through Walsingham's hands first. He had a master cryptanalyst named Thomas Philippes who could break any code Mary used. Every word she wrote was intercepted, decoded and read before being sent on its way. The conspiracy that would destroy Mary centred on a 25-year-old Catholic gentleman named Anthony Babington and a Jesuit priest named John Ballard. Their plan had 6 stages: a foreign invasion of England, the assassination of Elizabeth, a rising of English Catholics, the rescue of Mary from captivity, Mary's installation on the English throne, the restoration of Catholicism. Walsingham knew about every detail. He had agents inside the conspiracy from the beginning. On July 17th, 1586, Mary made the decision that would cost her her life. She wrote a lengthy cipher letter to Babington. In it, she affirmed her desire to escape. She discussed the plot. And, crucially, she used language that Walsingham's prosecutors would interpret as explicit consent to Elizabeth's assassination. The exact phrase was this: she told the plotters to proceed with taking order upon the accomplishing of their design. Whether Mary understood that their design meant murdering her cousin, or whether she was referring only to her own rescue, has been debated by historians for centuries. What's certain is that Walsingham had exactly what he needed. But then Walsingham did something controversial. He had the letter deciphered and sent to Babington, but with an added postscript asking for the names of the 6 men who would carry out Elizabeth's assassination. Here's where historians diverge sharply. Some argue this postscript was added by Walsingham himself, not by Mary, that the spymaster was gilding the lily, adding damning evidence to a letter that was already incriminating enough. The reciphered copy was so perfect that it appeared to be an original communication from Mary. And the names, the assassins, that was information Mary never actually requested. On August 11th, 1586, while Mary was out riding near Chartley Castle, she was arrested. She had been enjoying a brief moment of freedom, fresh air, sunlight. The feeling of a horse beneath her after so many years confined her chambers. Then she saw the riders approaching, and she knew. Her secretaries, Claude Now and Gilbert Curle, were taken to London for questioning. Under interrogation, they confirmed that the correspondence was genuine, that they had written and sent letters on Mary's behalf. Mary was moved to Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, a heavily fortified medieval castle, remote from London, ideally suited for holding a dangerous state prisoner. It would serve as both her courthouse and her tomb. The trial of Mary Stuart began on October 14th, 1586. 36 English nobles assembled at Fotheringhay to judge a foreign queen, something that had never happened before in English history. Among them were William Cecil, Lord Burghley, Elizabeth's chief minister, and Sir Francis Walsingham himself, the man who had orchestrated the entire trap. Mary was denied legal counsel. She would have to conduct her own defence. What happened next revealed that Mary was far more sophisticated than her accusers expected. She didn't simply deny the charges, she attacked the very foundation of the trial itself. Her first argument was jurisdictional. "I am no subject," she proclaimed, "and I would rather die 1,000 deaths than acknowledge myself to be one." As a foreign queen, she argued, she could not be tried for treason in an English court. Treason was a crime committed by subjects against their sovereign. Mary was no one's subject. Her second argument challenged the evidence. She had not been allowed to examine the documents being used against her. She couldn't call witnesses in her defence. The letters, she insisted, were counterfeit and had been tampered with after she'd seen them. Her third argument was theological. She invoked her status as an anointed queen, claiming that executing her would be a sin, that the majesty and safety of all princes falleth to the ground if they depend upon the writings and testimony of their secretaries. And finally, she denied intent. She claimed she had never consented to Elizabeth's assassination, only to her own rescue. "I would never make shipwreck of my soul," she declared passionately, "by conspiring the destruction of my dearest sister." The prosecution's case was formidable despite Mary's eloquent defence. Anthony Babington himself had confessed to the plot and pleaded guilty at his own trial. Walsingham produced the deciphered English transcript of Mary's July 17th letter. The prosecution presented what appeared to be an exact replica of Mary's original letter in cipher, and Mary's own secretaries had confirmed that they had written the letters on her behalf. When this evidence was presented, Mary burst into tears, but she continued to deny her involvement, insisting the documents were forgeries. Walsingham responded by proclaiming his own innocence, asserting that the documents were absolutely authentic. On October 25th, 1586, the commission reconvened. The verdict: guilty. The formal judgment stated that Mary was not only accessory and privy to the conspiracy, but also an imaginer and compass of Her Majesty's destruction. Mary demanded to be heard before Parliament or before Elizabeth herself. It made no difference. The trial had been as much political theatre as legal proceeding. The outcome had likely been determined before it began. What happened over the next 3 months reveals something crucial about Elizabeth and about the impossible position she found herself in. On October 29, 1586, Parliament convened to discuss Mary's fate. They formally petitioned Elizabeth to execute her cousin. This was unprecedented. Parliament was demanding that the Queen sign a death warrant for a fellow monarch. Elizabeth refused. Her reasons were complex. Some were political. She worried about the reaction of Catholic powers abroad, particularly Spain and France. She feared how her own Catholic subjects might respond. But some reasons seemed more personal. Elizabeth was genuinely troubled by the thought of executing a fellow queen and close relative. She understood the dangerous precedent it would set, and according to some accounts, she hoped Mary would repent and beg for forgiveness, providing a way out of the dilemma. Throughout the winter of 1586, Parliament and her council continued to pressure Elizabeth. On December 4th, she signed a proclamation of Mary's guilt, but still refused to sign the death warrant. The situation couldn't last forever. Finally, on February 1st, 1587, Elizabeth capitulated. She called her secretary William Davison to her chambers and asked him to bring Mary's execution warrant. She signed it. But then she added a caveat, and here Elizabeth's political cunning becomes apparent. She told Davison to ask Walsingham to write to Sir Amias Paulet requesting that he kill Mary privately, without a formal execution. Think about what she was asking. If Paulet murdered Mary quietly, Elizabeth could disclaim responsibility. It would look like the actions of an overzealous jailer, not the decision of a queen. Elizabeth would have Mary dead without the blood on her own hands. Paulet was horrified. "God forbid," he wrote back, "that I should make so foul a shipwreck of my conscience." The strict Protestant who had shown Mary no kindness during her imprisonment, who had treated her as nothing more than a threat to be contained, even he would not murder her in cold blood. There were limits to what he would do for his queen. What happened next remains historically debated. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, convened a secret meeting of the Privy Council. Without informing Elizabeth, Cecil and the council agreed to send the signed warrant directly to Fotheringhay Castle. Cecil appointed the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent to direct the execution. He deliberately kept Elizabeth in the dark. The warrant arrived at Fotheringhay on February 7th, 1587. Mary learned she would die the following morning. She had perhaps 12 hours left to live. She spent them exactly as you might expect from everything we know about her character, in prayer, in contemplation, and in caring for the people who had served her. At 2 in the morning on February 8th, Mary sat down to write her final letter. It was addressed to King Henri III of France, her former brother-in-law, the ruler of the country where she had spent her happiest years. "Tonight, after dinner, I've been advised of my sentence," she wrote. "I am to be executed like a criminal at 8 in the morning." She continued, "I have not had time to give you a full account of everything that has happened, but if you will listen to my doctor and my other unfortunate servants, you will learn the truth. And how, thanks be to God, I scorn death and vow that I meet it innocent of any crime, even if I were their subject." And then, in what might be the most revealing passage of the entire letter, she turned to what actually concerned her. "It remains for me to beg your most Christian Majesty, my brother-in-law and old ally, who have always protested your love for me, to give proof now of your goodness on all these points. Firstly, by charity, in paying my unfortunate servants the wages due them. This is a burden on my conscience that only you can relieve. 6 hours from death, and what weighed on Mary's conscience was whether her servants would be paid. The letter concluded simply, 'Your very and most sister are.' She sealed it with wax in such a way that any tampering would be immediately evident. One final precaution from a woman who had learned never to trust that her words would reach their intended recipient unchanged. Throughout the night, Mary distributed her possessions among her household members, her jewellery, her personal items, the small tokens she had accumulated over 19 years of captivity. At 6 in the morning, she read her will aloud to her staff, and all through the night the sound of hammering echoed through Fotheringhay Castle as workmen constructed the scaffold in the Great Hall. At dawn on February 8th, 1587, 300 people gathered in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay to witness something that had never happened before in English history, the execution of an anointed queen. The scaffold was modest, about 2 feet high and 12 feet broad, draped entirely in black cloth. Railings surrounded it, a low stool, a long cushion, a wooden block, all covered in black. Mary emerged from her chambers dressed in black satin embroidered with black velvet, with a white peaked headdress and white veil flowing down her back. In her hands she carried a crucifix and a prayer book. Around her neck hung a pomander and 2 rosaries. According to the eyewitnesses present, she stepped up to the scaffold, with her countenance careless, importing thereby rather mirth than mournful cheer. Not fear, not despair, something closer to serenity. She had been preparing for this moment for 19 years. Before mounting the scaffold, Mary knelt before the executioners, a man named Bull and his assistant. According to custom, they requested her forgiveness for what they were about to do. "I forgive you with all my heart," Mary told them, "for now, I hope, you shall make an end of all my troubles." She then requested that a Catholic priest be allowed to hear her final confession. The request was refused. The Earl of Kent and other Protestant officials present denied her this last comfort of her faith. Instead, a Protestant dean attempted to offer spiritual guidance, but Mary gently refused him. "Mr. Dean, trouble not yourself any more, for I am settled and resolved in this my religion, and am purposed therein to die." As Mary prepared for the block, her ladies-in-waiting helped her remove her outer garments. She made a poignant comment about the indignity, saying that she was not used to disrobing in public, especially before so large an assemblage. But when the black dress came away, the 300 witnesses saw what Mary had hidden beneath it. Crimson underskirts, scarlet, the traditional liturgical colour of Catholic martyrdom. This was not accidental. Mary understood exactly how this moment would be perceived across Catholic Europe. She was making a statement. She was dying not as a criminal, but as a martyr for her faith. One of her ladies, Jane Kennedy, tied a white veil embroidered in gold over Mary's eyes as a blindfold. Mary knelt down on the cushion in front of the block. She positioned her head upon it. She stretched out her arms in a cruciform gesture, and in Latin she spoke her final words, the words of Christ on the cross. "In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum." "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." What followed was a tragedy of incompetence. The first blow of the axe missed Mary's neck cleanly. It struck the back of her head instead. According to witnesses, she made very small noise or none at all, and did not stir, but she was not dead. The executioner required a second stroke, then a third, cutting through the remaining sinew to fully sever her head from her body. 300 people watched this happen. It took 3 blows to kill the Queen of Scots, and every single witness would remember it for the rest of their lives. When the executioner lifted Mary's severed head aloft and proclaimed, "God save the Queen," something unexpected happened. The auburn tresses in his hand came away, a wig. The head fell to the ground. Underneath was what Mary had successfully hidden throughout her imprisonment: short, grey hair. The woman who had once been considered one of the most beautiful princesses in Europe had aged beyond recognition during her 19 years of captivity. One observer noted that her lips stirred up and down a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off. Perhaps the most haunting detail emerged in the moments after Mary's death. A small dog, a Skye Terrier named Geddon, suddenly appeared from beneath the folds of Mary's dress. She had brought it with her to her execution, hidden under her skirts. The dog went directly to the headless body of its mistress and lay down in her blood. It refused to move. It refused to let anyone approach Mary's body. According to accounts, it refused to eat afterward. The dog eventually died, likely from grief. Some historians believe it was buried with Mary, though this remains uncertain. Elizabeth's government moved immediately to prevent Mary from becoming a saint. Everything that had touched her blood, her clothing, the wooden block, the scaffold cloth, every piece of fabric, was burned in the fireplace of the Great Hall. Nothing could be allowed to survive as a Catholic relic. Mary's body was embalmed. Her heart and entrails were removed and buried secretly somewhere within Fotheringhay Castle grounds, ensuring they could never be recovered for veneration. Her body was wrapped in a wax winding sheet and placed in a lead coffin. There it remained at Fotheringhay for almost 6 months. On July 30th, 1587, Mary's coffin was finally transported to Peterborough Cathedral in the dead of night, for fear that a daytime procession might spark protests or violence. Mary had requested burial either at the Basilica of Saint-Denis in France, where her first husband Francis II rested, or at Rounds, where her mother lay. Elizabeth denied both requests. Instead, Mary received a Protestant state funeral. No Scottish lords were present. It was a final indignity from the cousin who had held her prisoner for 19 years. When Elizabeth learned that the warrant had been sent, that Mary was already dead, she flew into a rage. According to contemporary accounts, when she was told at 9 in the morning on February 9th that Mary had been executed the day before, she was seized with great indignation. Her countenance and words failed her, and with excessive sorrow she was in a manner astonished, insomuch as she gave herself over to grief, putting herself into mourning weeds and shedding abundance of tears. She sharply rebuked her council and commanded them out of her sight. Walsingham fled to his home, claiming illness. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester and Burghley were temporarily banished from court. William Davison, Elizabeth's secretary, the man who had simply brought her the warrant to sign, became the scapegoat. He was arrested, tried for acting without proper authorisation, imprisoned in the Tower of London, heavily fined. Only Burghley's intervention prevented his execution. This theatrical punishment served a purpose. It allowed Elizabeth to publicly appear as if she were a victim of court conspiracies, as if her counsel had acted without her knowledge or consent. Whether she truly believed this, or whether it was political theatre designed to manage the international fallout, historians have debated ever since. Mary's execution sent shockwaves across Europe. In Catholic countries, she was immediately celebrated as a martyr. Pamphlets circulated. Religious literature portrayed her death as a sacrifice for the faith. The woman who had been a prisoner became, in death, a symbol. King Philip II of Spain reportedly wept when he learned of Mary's execution, and her death became a major catalyst for what happened next, the Spanish Armada. In 1588, just 1 year after Mary's death, Philip launched a massive invasion fleet against England. The Armada's goals were to overthrow Elizabeth, avenge Mary's death, and restore Catholicism to England. The invasion failed, but its very existence was partly a response to what happened in that great hall at Fotheringhay. James VI of Scotland, Mary's son, the infant who had become king when she was forced to abdicate, made diplomatic protests. He attempted to intercede with Elizabeth on his mother's behalf, but his efforts were largely performative. Though he protested vigorously and temporarily severed diplomatic relations with England, James ultimately accepted the execution without taking military action. It was pragmatic. Aggressive action against Elizabeth would have jeopardised his own claim to the English throne. And when Elizabeth died in 1603, it was James VI of Scotland who succeeded her as James I of England. The son of the woman Elizabeth had executed became Elizabeth's heir. Mary's grandson would eventually rule both kingdoms. In 1612, 25 years after her death, James commissioned a magnificent marble monument for his mother in the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey. Mary's remains were exhumed from Peterborough and moved to their final resting place. She lies there today, directly opposite the tomb of Queen Elizabeth I, the two cousins, separated in life by religion, politics and tragedy, united in death by the architecture of Westminster Abbey. Their tombs face each other across the chapel, as if still watching, still waiting, still locked in the conflict that defined both their lives. Was Mary guilty? The evidence suggests she was complicit in something, that she expressed sympathy for plots against Elizabeth, even if the specific Babington plot was partially engineered by Walsingham. But was her trial fair? She was denied legal counsel, barred from examining evidence, forbidden from calling witnesses, tried for treason in a country where she was not a subject, by a court that had no legitimate jurisdiction over her. Walsingham's double agents may have manufactured the very conspiracy they accused her of joining. The postscript requesting the names of assassins may have been added after Mary's letter was sent. The entire trap may have been designed not to catch a genuine criminal, but to create one. We'll never know for certain. The documents that could prove Walsingham's manipulation, if they ever existed, have long since been destroyed or lost. What we do know is this. At 2 in the morning on February 8, 1587, a woman who had been a queen since she was 6 days old sat down to write her final letter. And what weighed on her conscience in those last hours was whether her servants would be paid. That tells us something about who Mary Stuart really was. Whether she was a martyr or a murderer, a victim of circumstance or an architect of her own destruction, she faced her end with more dignity than anyone had a right to expect. She forgave her executioners. She comforted her weeping servants. She died proclaiming her innocence and her faith. And 19 years of captivity, a rigged trial, and a botched execution couldn't take that away from her. The execution of Mary Stuart wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a chain of events that would reshape Europe. Because when Philip II of Spain launched his armada to avenge her death, he set in motion one of the most consequential naval battles in history, and created another dramatic story of last stands, impossible odds, and a queen who rode out to meet an invasion at Tilbury.